I'd now like to introduce our third speaker, who is Professor Ghassan Hage, and he is a future generation professor of anthropology and social theory at the University of Melbourne, and one of our most prominent theorists about racism and multiculturalism in Australia, and active in the Cronulla events as well. Not as a participant, but as a, well, actually as a participant. Among his books that I know many students read and discuss, as well as those of us who are older, are White Nation, Against Paranoid Nationalism, and most recently, Waiting. Ghassan.
Let me begin by saying that I'm not a great believer in a consortium of white or mildly white or mid-white people sitting together and deciding for themselves whether they are racist or not. Whether white Australia is racist or not. I think there is a certain amount of self-indulgence in which has been actually part of a wide international cultural current, which was manifested in Durban at the United Nations Conference on racism, where the great nations that brought you scientific racism, colonial slavery, colonial racism, colonial extermination, decided that it's up to them to work out who is and who isn't racist. And that third world looking people and third world cultures have got it wrong. Basically what they said, leave it to the superior race to determine who is racist and who is not. I'm not saying we're doing this here, but I think there's a whiff of it. I think there is a certain sense of, we can, white Australians, academics who are part of white culture, etc., can somehow decide without speaking to those who are subjected to racism and interrogating their subjectivity, whether really we are not racist. It's a long continuum of the amazing things that white people and white culture comes up with. For a superior culture, for a superior race, white people have certainly produced a lot of idiots and a lot of idiocies, if you ask me. And you have to, when people sort of like engage in this, remind them, why isn't there a bit of humility given your history, when you are asking such questions? And I think this is what I would like to talk about. It's about the culture of racism in Australia. It's not really about how many Australians are racist and how many are not. It's a different question to ask, are Australians racist? I don't think Australians are more or less racist than anybody else. I don't think the people who are racist all the time. I don't think white Australians have a monopoly over racism. I think sort of like Lebanese, Greek, Vietnamese are quite capable of doing a lot of racism themselves. So racism as a behavior is not a white disease of some sort or another. That's a different question. My question is is there a culture of racism in Australia? And what are we doing about it? Let me put it to you this way. Australia has constituted itself physically through a racist act as a territory. It is the product of an act of appropriation of a land and the decimation of a people who were defined racially. We are the inheritors and the beneficiaries of this foundational act of racist theft. And so, to my mind, if we want to ask to what extent Australia today still has a racist culture, we start with a self-indulgence. That is, it's not about whether we have or not. We do. How much are we doing to deal with it? How much are we doing to minimize the fact that we are a racist culture? Anyone who starts from a position of let's debate whether Australia is racist or not, to my mind, is already racist. Australia is racist. And remember, I'm not saying Australians are racist. I'm saying Australia has a racist culture. And so the starting point is, what do we do with it? Are we doing enough? When I say we are the inheritors of an act of theft, I think I'm just saying the obvious. I'm not trying to be sort of like controversial. I think it's an obvious fact. We are the inheritors of an act of theft. And the value of Australia's wealth today is not equal to the value of what was stolen. Sure. I think people who have come after the act of theft have built Australia's wealth, whether they are from England or from Lebanon or from Greece, all have increased Australia's economic wealth. But that does not change the fact that there is a proportion of the wealth of Australia, the economic wealth of Australia, which is, I will define, a black economy. It's a black economy in two ways. It is black economy in the sense that the source of this wealth is indigenous. It is a black economy in the sense that it is an economy of theft. We are all complicit in the circulation of stolen goods, and we are part of a black economy. Now, to my mind, when I see the intervention, the issue is not really whether the intervention is racist through what it is doing or what it is not. Sure, we have these debates, they're important. Are people doing the right thing? It's a question, when I say I'm talking about the culture of racism, I'm interested in how it is done. Is it done with a sense that we are returning some stolen goods? Is it done with a sense of humility? Is it done with a sense that we owe you and what we're giving you is not even 1/100th of what we owe you? Or is it done with a sense of we're so great because we're trying to deal with our indigenous problem? I think if it's done with humility, if it's done with a sense that no matter how much money we put in the indigenous sector, it's nowhere near what we should be putting. Nowhere near, not 100th. Simply in terms of economic value. And then we will be on the road towards dealing with this issue, what into my mind sort of like we'll start looking at attempting to deal with this primary racism. Any self-congratulatory stuff is simply a reproduction of this racism. Likewise, this original primary act has shattered indigenous psyches and has shattered indigenous society. That's what racism does, it shatters. In what way are we trying to help indigenous people recollect themselves such that the effect of this shattering is not reproduced? That is an issue. Australia not only has constituted itself territorially through this primary racist act, Australia has constituted itself symbolically through another racist act. It has defined itself through the White Australia policy. It has defined itself, and its imaginary has come into being against indigenous people through the repression of the indigenous presence as part of one's identity, and through a delineation of not wanting to be part of a third world looking environment. This is a racial mode of imagining the identity. Has this changed? It's not enough to say we used to think that we don't want third world looking people. Now we're very happy to have third world looking people. This can still mean we, white Australians, are happy to have third world looking people in Australia. It does not change the nature of our imaginary of ourselves. That is, when we think of ourselves, we Australian, and start having images that are not white, then we are talking about changes of identity. As long as we are still thinking, we Australians, and you think you're white, and you say, we're fantastic, we're having all these kind of like non-white people, and look at us, we haven't challenged the racist foundation of Australian identity. So, likewise then, there is a sense of the spirit in which things are done. Today, there's a debate about the asylum seekers. I'm not very qualified, really, despite the fact that 99% of the Australian population appears to be qualified in deciding sort of like what is happening with asylum seekers and what is the right policy. But I know for a fact that you can reject people in a racist way, and you can accept them in a racist way. And you can reject people in a non-racist way, and you can accept them in a non-racist way. I don't think rejecting or accepting asylum seekers is what determines whether we're doing it from a position of a culture of racism. When we say there is a culture of racism in this country, it means back to the basics. It means, do we think of others instrumentally, whether we think of them as good or bad? If you think of them only instrumentally, you're still steeped in racist culture. do you think of them as a life force? A life force that's very important in racism, in existential racism. That is, when another person or another being is next to me, do I feel that their life is important for my life? Does their life propel me? Or do I look at their life and I feel that it is diminishing my life simply by mere presence? That is core existential racism. And this seeps into all kinds of policies, all kinds of very nice policies, as well as nasty policies. It is, to my mind, when we want to start to deal with racism as culture, this is where the game starts. And we're nowhere near dealing with this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghassan. And our final speaker is also extremely well known to most of you, I expect. Judith Brett is a professor of politics and head of the School of Social Sciences at La Trobe University. She is probably the almost best-known historian of Australian liberalism and the Liberal Party. And among her books are Robert Menzies' Forgotten People, The Australian Liberals and the Moral Middle Class, and with Anthony Moran, Ordinary People's Politics. Judith.
Okay, what I'm going to do with my 15 minutes is to present you with some research findings about how ordinary Australians think or don't think about racial and ethnic difference. But I want to make a few preliminary remarks first. The question that I'm addressing is whether or not Australia is a racist country. And as we've all said, yes, there are racists in Australia, many but not all of whom are of Anglo descent, and I think Henry and John have both given us, and Ghassan too, a sense of the deep history that has formed some of those people, though I think they're probably also formed by other things besides the deep history. I mean, I think various forms of sort of gang culture and such can also form racist attitudes. And we have racist incidents, clearly, such as the Cronulla riots. I'm doing this sort of throat clearing, I suppose, partly because I'm sort of edgy about being put on what I see as the low moral ground on this question to some account. But the claim that Australia's racist has to be a stronger claim than that there are racists in Australia. It can be a claim about structural racism, and it's indisputable that Australia has structural racism in the past, with laws and state-sanctioned practices that discriminated amongst people on the basis of race. And I think we're all agreed up here, and I'm sure down there that there's no doubt about that. And we've heard from both John and from Henry about the way since the 1960s Australian governments have made concerted efforts to dismantle these and to put in place sanctions against race-based discrimination. Now, these sanctions don't always work, but that's a different sort of claim. The Australian state is not now a racist state. It neither enacts nor condones race-based discrimination. However, nor has it been able to rid Australia of racists, just as it's not been able to rid Australia of criminals or other forms of undesirable characters. That is, I think one of the things that's partly at play sometimes I feel in this debate is a sort of utopianism that imagines governments can do more about controlling human behaviour than they can. Now, the claim that Australia is a racist country can also be a claim about the Australian people and their social attitudes, that Australians have fundamentally racist patterns of thought and behaviour. And it seemed to me that often in these sorts of debates, incidents such as the Cronulla riots or the attacks on the Indian students are put forward as evidence of underlying habits of mind. And I think Sandy Gifford, in the piece that she wrote in the Age and that was circulated on the La Trobe website, was partly guilty of that form of logic. They're tips of the iceberg that are seen to reveal a submerged truth of racist attitudes which are then available for political mobilisation when figures such as Pauline Hanson come along. Now, I'm not convinced by this line of thinking. On the other side of the scale to the Cronulla riots and the attacks on Indian students and various other race-based crimes, we have to put the countless incidents of Australians of different races reaching out to each other, making friends and getting along. And there's plenty of evidence in people's day-to-day lives of harmony amongst racially different groups and people. And I think we need to try and understand why and how this works, as well as why it sometimes doesn't. And in response to Ghassan's argument, I mean, this isn't always just about, whites reaching out hands and saying, oh, we're very pleased to have you nice brown people here. I mean, it's also, Australia is no longer simply, there's many other non-white people living in Australia, so it's also about the ways in which they are forming friendships and social connections across racial differences. So the material that I want to talk about addresses the question of whether or not contemporary Australians are racists, and it comes from a larger project which I undertook with Anthony Moran here in sociology and Gwyn Threlkel, who teaches at Wodonga. 75 people were interviewed over 2 phases. The first lot were interviewed in the middle of the 1980s by some other people, and the second here were interviewed in the early 2000s. All the people were living in Victoria when they were interviewed, in inner and outer suburban Melbourne and large regional towns, and some people in rural districts. And that may be relevant to the relatively mild attitudes that I'm going to report. And it may well be, as John said, that you take some of those people and you put them into a different social location and their attitudes would be different, because after all, our attitudes are partly formed by the social milieu and the experiences that we're trying to make sense of. They were mixed by occupation, gender and by ethnic background, and 40% of them were of non-Anglo descent. The respondents were interviewed 3 to 5 times in long semi-structured interviews, so we've got between 6 and 12 hours of material for each person. That is, they talked a lot. If they were disguising, just being polite in the interviews, they were very good at maintaining it for a long time. Views on immigration, race, multiculturalism and cultural diversity were expressed in answer both to particular questions about those issues, but also in response to general questions such as, what do you think are Australia's most pressing problems? Or how has Australia changed in the past 20 years? And they also emerged in people's life stories, particularly those of first and second generation respondents of non-Anglo background. Now, I want to, if you like, break it off. I don't want to talk about people's attitudes on Indigenous Australians, except to say that for the most part, these Victorians who we interviewed, they were pretty vague and pretty underdeveloped. People were very uneasy talking about Aborigines. They had little knowledge, little experience. They knew the situation was dreadful. They felt ashamed. They thought something should be done, but they didn't know what. Instead, I want to talk about their responses to Australia's increased racial diversity. Now, only one of our 75 respondents I should say, was what I gave an unambiguously racist and xenophobic response. And this was a 23-year-old male sportsman, sort of guy who would have been at Cronulla. I'm a bit like Bruce Ruxton on the Vietnamese. He said, we should be getting rid of them. I used to live in Springvale. It's spot your Aussie out there. Ruxton says what others think. This is an interview from the 1980s. The rest were generally positive about Australia's immigration, created diversity, which they described in terms of multiculturalism. Very few talked much about race, although race was used as a term. In fact, people used race, nationality, background, culture, lifestyle, ethnicity almost interchangeably. The sort of things we ask our students to think about in sociology classes, with fine nuances amongst those different ways of categorising social groups, not happening out there. Overwhelmingly then, our respondents thought that Australia's mixed multiracial and multicultural population was a good thing, bringing many benefits both to the society as a whole and to themselves as individuals. However, they did have worries and anxieties, and what we were interested in was the ways they expressed those and then the ways they tried to calm themselves down. As it happened, the 2 interview phases coincided with periods of intense public debate about race and immigration. In the second half of the 1980s, Australia woke up to the presence for the first time since the 19th century of a sizable Asian immigrant group in its midst, the Vietnamese who'd been settled after the Vietnam War. Geoffrey Blaney warned that the rate of recent immigration from Asia was threatening Australia's social cohesion. And the 1988 Fitzgerald report that was commissioned by the Labor government found that there was at that point in the late 1980s low levels of popular support for the current immigration program. John Howard, who was then leader of the opposition, bought into this debate, and he raised the possibility of racial restrictions on Australia's immigration intake, if this was in the interests of public cohesion. And then there was a bit of a sort of public free-for-all with Bruce Ruxton coming in and standing up for the rights of an old-style xenophobic nationalism to say what it thought, despite the strictures of political correctness. There was a bit of a forerunner of the sorts of debates that then took place when John Howard became Prime Minister. The second round of interviews occurred after the 2001 attacks on the Twin Towers, when anxiety about Muslim immigrants was running high throughout the Western world. And for our research then, these coincidences were fortuitous because they gave us a great deal of material in which people were thinking about the problems potentially posed by Australia's racial, cultural and religious diversity. In both periods and in both our sets of interviews, it was clear that people were well aware of the public debates and of the racist views and actions of some of their fellow citizens. And they used various strategies to contain or limit the significance of these and to distance themselves from them. Racism and prejudice were frequently linked with ignorance. People would say, oh, it's the lowest common denominator, or there's a bunch of troublemakers out there. But people also felt that the media exaggerated it. That is, they felt in their day-to-day life they didn't see a lot of evidence of the sort of racism that the media was reporting or that the politicians and public figures were debating. So in the first set of interviews we had 13 of the 42 respondents specifically mentioned the views of Blaney, Ruxton and Howard in order to distance themselves from them or to blame the media for exaggerating them. But as I said, in both sets of interviews, respondents did express worries and reservations about aspects of the two communities that were at the centre of those two phases of the public debates. In the case of the Vietnamese, the worries were most associated with drugs and crime, with the Muslims most associated with religious intolerance and attitudes to women. When we were analysing the interview transcripts, what we were struck with was how frequently, when people expressed an anxiety or a negative attitude, they'd follow that with a qualification or a counterexample, as if having expressed an anxiety about possible negative consequences of an ethnically diverse population, they then were at pains to calm it down or contain it and to reassure themselves. And I think that's one of the strengths of this sort of semi-structured qualitative work as against opinion polling, which may have picked up the anxiety but then not picked up the way in which that was then the person then reasoned about that. Most of the problems and anxieties that people raised in relationship both to the Vietnamese, the Muslims and to immigration issues generally had to do with what we called groupness. People sticking together in their ethnic groups, in residential enclaves, people not mixing, people not being able to speak English so you can't communicate with them, parents who don't orient their children to a wider society. 36 of our 75 respondents raised these sorts of worries about what we've called groupness. Some linked this to the insularity of the ethnic groups themselves. So a 21-year-old second-generation Italian woman said it was unfair of Muslims to keep to themselves because then you couldn't learn from them. A 33-year-old Anglo woman living in the outer suburbs of Melbourne believed that interest in cultural diversity had to go both ways. I don't like them not showing an interest in our culture or making fun of the skippies. In the first set of interviews, problems about not mixing were most often attributed to the Vietnamese and in the second to Muslims. Time and again, people we talked to answered questions about groups and social categories, which we were interested in as sociologists, with answers about individuals. Often they didn't even understand what you meant when you asked them questions about groups. Not only did they interpret multiculturalism as a mix of individuals and ignore the issue of group rights and cultural maintenance, which preoccupies much of the public debate in the multicultural literature, but they actively resisted talks about groups and social categories. As in this comment from a 24-year-old female Lebanese Christian social work student who was interviewed in 2003. She said, "I've gotten over this idea of these people, whether it's city people, rural people, Australian, some particular ethnicity. Any sort of categorisation you might want to have, there's an even mix of good and bad, though deep down there's more good." a young Aboriginal woman, said, "I don't look at groupings like culturally, socially. Everything is so diverse. It's getting harder and harder to group. People are moving beyond structures." Now, I think this general resistance that we found to seeing people in terms of their sort of group-based identities is very relevant to our discussion today. Racial prejudice involves judging people in terms of their appearance, the colour of their skin, labelling them and then attributing to them all sorts of group-based stereotypes. What we found was that people worked hard not to do this and, in fact, generally thought it was an illegitimate way to treat other people. This resistance to group-based generalisations was expressed in commonplaces such as "there's good and bad in all groups, races, cultures, nations." Again, they used individually. Or variations of it such as "you can't talk about a whole race, only a few unfortunate individuals. In every country in the world there are some lovely and some horrible people. I don't see slovenliness and disorderliness and crime as belonging to any particular group. Australians can stand up to anyone with regard to criminal activities. If you look for good qualities in people, you will find them wherever you look. If you want to find bad qualities, you will find them." Such arguments were used both to resist the stereotyping of immigrant ethnic groups and to resist claims that Australians themselves were racist. "It goes both ways," said a 54-year-old Italian woman. "All Australians are not the same." The implication of these comments was that you needed to respond to people as individuals and that their moral qualities were attributes of them as individuals and that moral qualities weren't, if you like, carried by groups. So, to conclude, at the level of the social, racism involves people acting hostilely towards others on the basis of their skin colour and putting them into race-based categories and judging them accordingly. We didn't find evidence of this in our research. In fact, we found a deeply held individualism on which people drew as they learned to live in the increasingly diverse place Australia had become during their lifetime. This did lead to hostility to certain cultural forms associated with certain immigrant groups, in particular those which had strong religious institutions and separatist cultural practices. But it doesn't seem to me that this is usefully thought about in terms of racism. It's, I would argue, much more about Australia's very secular public culture and a sort of, I think, quite historically deep suspicion of overt religious behaviour, and it's also, I think, linked to very deeply held assumptions about modernity and an understanding, if you like, a social imaginary in which a society is made up of individuals. But that's, I think, a discussion, a different discussion. Thank you very much.